Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations. First, thank you very much for taking your time and accept our interview.
It's a great pleasure.
So, so first, I'll start with your recent trip to Pakistan. You saw the catastrophe by flood in your own very eyes, and you said there that Pakistan has not contributed in a meaningful way to climate change, yet Pakistan is one of the most dramatically impacted countries by climate change. Do you think that industrialized countries, especially developed countries, they have done enough to mitigate the climate change? And what do you expect them to do except making promises?
I would say that almost nobody has done enough. Developed countries have an historical responsibility for the many decades in the past in which they were the main emitters. Today we have emerging economies that are also very relevant big emitters, and we need to guarantee two things. First is that developed countries reduce quickly their emissions, and second, that they cooperate with the emerging economies and other developing countries with finance, with technology, with support, in order to allow them to accelerate also the green transition of their economies that they cannot do by themselves because they came later in the development process. So there is an essential question here. Developed countries have promised $100 billion per year in 2020. We are in 2022, it has not yet happened. And this is just a drop in the ocean. I mean, we also need a stronger engagement of international financial institutions in climate action, in support of developing countries, and leveraging private finance to support developing countries on this. Then look at Pakistan, the devastation that took place. Obviously, you cannot avoid a situation like that, but you can, to a large extent, control it better if you have massively invested in what is called adaptation, in building resilience, in having resilient infrastructure. I mean, just a simple thing. The roads that had been built higher resisted. The roads that have been built at a lower level were destroyed, which means investments need to be made, namely in the countries that are more impacted by climate change, to protect those countries from the impact, the devastating impact of climate change. But that requires investment, and that requires knowledge and technology. And these developed countries need to provide. There was a promise of $40 billion per year in Glasgow. We'll see whether the promise will be met or not, but it's not enough. Developing countries need about $300 billion per year to invest in adaptation, in resilience, to protect their societies. And then there is loss and damage. Loss and damage is in the Paris Agreement, but until now there has not been a serious discussion and a serious mechanism of action to put it seriously on the table. So I hope that in Cairo, finally, it will be possible to have serious discussions and action on loss and damage.
A year ago, the Chinese President Xi Jinping proposed Global Development Initiative here in UNGA 76 to promote people's well-being. How do you think this Global Development Initiative could help achieve the SDGs?
It was exactly launched to support the implementation of the SDGs. And obviously, any initiative aiming at overcoming that gap that exists is extremely welcome. There will be, by the way, during this week, a meeting of the group of friends of the initiative. I will send a message and we will be fully represented. And this initiative and others that other countries might be able to put on the table will be very much welcome, because we need to rescue the Sustainable Development Goals, and that is exactly the objective of the Global Development Initiative.
Since 1980s, you've been traveled to China many times. How would you describe the major change in China, and do you think that would the development story would benefit the global community?
No, I think that the most important change, I think there are many changes in many aspects, and there are even aspects at which we might disagree, but there is one thing that is true, and that is absolutely remarkable. Poverty is something that we should eradicate in the world. And China was able to eradicate extreme poverty in 2020 and has brought to the middle class hundreds and hundreds of millions of people. Now, this change is a very important change, and it had also an enormous impact in the global welfare indicators. So if I had to choose one thing that I've seen the change, the first time I was in China was in 84, probably.
Yes.
84, the first time. I remember being in Guangdong, and there was a bridge, and at sunset there were, I would say, millions of bicycles crossing. There were no cars, and the city, showed the poverty of the people. If we go there now, we see a completely different picture, and that is something that needs recognition.
We know that different countries have different developing models, but do you think China's development story can give some inspirations to some of the developing countries?
As you said, different countries have different models. There are different cultures, different approaches to work, to the life in society, even visions about human rights, about welfare. So different countries have, indeed, different ways. But we should be able to look into what are the aspects of this development model that can be applied in other societies and take profit of it.
Okay, now we're going to discuss something about the challenges the UN faces now.
If I may, that is exactly the logic of the so-called South-South cooperation.
Okay, so we're going to talk about the challenges now the United Nations face. For some developed countries, the United Nations is vitally important. Yet with geopolitical tensions rising nowadays, some feel some issues like humanitarian assistance, human rights, they could be politicized. And how can the UN keep its objectivity to show all the member states, especially developing countries, that they can rely on the United Nations for its support and justice?
Now, the United Nations is committed to all aspects of its agenda. The peace and security aspects, the sustainable development aspects, including climate, the humanitarian aid, and the human rights. And of course, the first thing that is important when we talk about human rights and humanitarian aid is that human rights are respected and humanitarian aid is provided. So there is always a risk of politicizing, but that risk should not be a pretext not to respect human rights or not to distribute humanitarian aid. And so my appeal is for the international community to be able, without other objectives, but the real value of these things, to invest in humanitarian aid and to invest in human rights.
And another issue I think the UN faces nowadays is, many people think that the UN now is facing a crisis of confidence, that it cannot play some key role in many critical issues. What's your response?
I think there is a crisis of confidence, but that is a more generalized crisis of confidence and trust in the societies in general and in the international community. But when people talk about it, they are mainly thinking about the Security Council, where the geopolitical divides do not allow to have a common position in relation to some of the most complex crises that we face at the present moment. But if you look at the UN as a whole, half of the humanitarian assistance, international humanitarian assistance in the world is distributed through the UN. I mean, without the World Food Programme, can you imagine what would happen in the world? I mean, the role of UNICEF or the International Agency for Migration or the Refugee Agency that I was myself in charge of. I mean, I remember the millions of people we have helped in the most desperate situations. So we need to see the UN in its entirety. The UN that is supporting countries in development, the UN that is the greater promoter of the Sustainable Development Goals, the Agenda 2030, of justice in relation to developing countries, the UN that represents with its peacekeeping, and China is very much involved in peacekeeping, the protection of civilians in the most difficult situations, sometimes with the peacekeepers themselves being killed and sacrificing their lives for the protection of others. So I think that if one looks at the confidence indicators there are, you know, all these surveys that are made, I feel that the UN is still respected by the majority of the people in the world. There is a problem that is difficult to solve, which is the fact that we have a geopolitical divide that impacts on the UN and impacts in many other things.
One last question. 6 years ago,
and we need one world, not several.
One last question, Secretary General. 6 years ago, when you were elected Secretary General, you talked to my colleague in Beijing. You said that Secretary General of the United Nations has to be a fighter, and at the same time, it's an impossible job. Now, after 6 years in office, do you consider yourself a fighter, and what you learned from this impossible job?
Well, I learned that, first of all, contrary to what many people think, discreet diplomacy is still more effective than megaphone diplomacy. Most of the agreements that we have been able to reach, we have done it very quietly. The grain agreement that everybody considers quite an achievement, it was done with months of negotiations, very discreetly, until we finally got to a solution. So I'm more and more, the more confusion there is in the global public opinions with all these social medias and things of the sort, the more I believe that there is still a space for discreet diplomacy, provided that diplomacy is not biased, provided that diplomacy is based on impartiality, as it is the case of the United Nations. And the second thing I've learned is that you cannot solve all the problems of the world. But if you are able to rescue one person from hunger and famine, if you are able to avoid someone else to be killed or an innocent man to be jailed, that is very important. And that is what makes our heart feeling that what we are doing makes sense.
Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, thank you very much.
All the best. Thank you very much. Xie xie.